Hello, and welcome back to this now final part of the podcast prior to the Social Science Training for Natural Sciences event in Edinburgh. This final part will talk about the ethical considerations that you might need to think about when you're undertaking social science research or interdisciplinary research. And it's something which has become increasingly important within universities to ensure that all projects have got ethical approval and that all researchers are aware of the potential ethical implications of the work they're doing. And part of this is the fact that within most social sciences that we're dealing with phenomena that relates to or impacts upon people. And in terms of the University of Manchester, for instance, any research which involves people in any capacity has to gain ethical approval. And this can cover things such as data collection, the confidentiality and consent that people give and provide for research participation, the rights of people during and after the research project, so how we actually manage data and how we manage the reporting of the findings to our participants. And again, a bit like setting the research questions, it's very, very important to think about the ethical considerations because one of the changes that we've seen, particularly in journal publications recently, is that many journals are now asking for a confirmation that ethical approval has been sought and is being delivered for a project before a paper can be actually published. So it's quite important that we start to think about these things at a very sort of early stage. And part of this is the fact that the work that we do in social sciences tends to look at social phenomena, be it about society, be it about the economy, or be it about people's behaviours. And that means that most of the projects that we look at might have an impact on people's lives as individuals, or as communities, or as societies. And so we have to understand that this might lead to a discussion of issues that are sensitive. It might have negative impacts on their communities if we actually find something that is happening which needs to be changed in policy or practice. So we need to think about the implications of what our research actually may or may not be doing. Because if we don't, then we could end up finding that we actually are causing more harm than good with each of our projects. Now, what I would say here is that if you haven't already, I would check your university or institution's guidance on ethical considerations. This is the one here from the University of Manchester. And it gives quite clear instructions about what projects will need ethical approval, how you might go about doing that, and what sort of information you have to provide to gain ethical approval. So I think the main point to sort of say here is that don't assume that you're being ethical. Always check. And it seems counterintuitive that we all sort of know we're doing things okay, but we need to ensure that we're covered by the university insurance for one thing, but also that we are aware of the possible dangers of the research that we're undertaking.
And this becomes particularly important if you're dealing with at-risk or vulnerable groups. So certainly at the University of Liverpool, where these quotes come from, um, if you want to work with groups like this, it can still be possible, but you generally need a more rigorous form of ethical approval. So at Liverpool, if you don't want to work with one of these groups, you can generally get what's called expedited approval, so a quicker approval process. But some of the kind of key groups who might be at risk or vulnerable. Um, so obviously participants who may be considered potentially vulnerable in some way, participants who lack capacity to give informed consent, or who during the research project may come to lack capacity. So that I guess is particularly for medical researchers. Participants who hold a public role or who represent the views of their profession. So often, for instance, I might be interviewing councillors, members of councils, or for instance, I do work with planners, town planners who might be members of the Royal Town Planning Institute. So they need to be careful about and clear about whether the views they're expressing are their own or their professional views. And then, of course, participants who might not adequately understand verbal explanations or written information given in English, which could include people for whom English is not their first language, people with a learning disability, or, of course, children. And if you're wanting to do work with groups like that, then you have to be particularly careful that you are making sure that your research is not likely to have any negative impact on them.
And one way that we do this is to provide information for our participants in social science projects and we inform them of a number of different issues which they then have the rights to either have explained further or to withdraw their information. So firstly, we would normally have an information sheet that we would use to set out the context and explain what the project is, and to explain why their participation would actually be beneficial to the project. So it might be that we're seeking the views of the public about a new development, and so their views will then be taken into account in terms of the consultative process. And part of this will be that it will explain what will happen if they take part, so what will happen to their data, how the information will be used, how they will be formed about, how the data will be analysed and reported back to them. So it gives them almost a full life cycle of information about the whys, the hows, and the whats, and then how it will be taken forward in the future. An important thing to note here is that it should also explain how they can make a complaint against the researcher or the research project. And I think we've probably all seen student dissertation forms where they have to do a consent form, and it will have your name and email at the bottom of it. And so if they upset the public or a business, they can contact you. But it is really important to provide an option or a channel where people can actually make a complaint against the project if they feel they haven't been informed about the parameters of the study, or it's been undertaken without professional standards being upheld. And that can be quite a difficult thing to try and phrase, but again, each of your institutions will normally have a set form of wording that we can use. One of the other key aspects about the information sheets will be the presentation of confidentiality. So most projects with professional people, they might be okay with having their names or their positions actually reported in a project. This is not always the case though, so we have to be able to suggest that we will provide anonymity for people, and that their names and their job titles will potentially be removed from any publication or representation of the data. And again, it has to be quite a clear statement about what will be done and how we will do it, because we have to be able to say to people that they can talk openly and with confidence about an issue without fear of reprisals, be it in legal senses, social senses, or economic senses. And so those first sort of four things are really sort of setting the scene about the project, and a couple of procedural and sort of almost legal issues that we have to think about. But then we also need to think about how we explain how the results of the study will be used, and how they will be reported, and how they will be presented to different audiences. So we have to make clear that the research has a clear focus, a clear aim, and what we hope to get out of it. So that might involve at the end, it might be academic papers, it might be presentations to politicians or decision makers, or it might be feeding back to community groups or stakeholders through a series of networking events. But people should be informed up front exactly how their data will be used, and how they will then receive copies of it. We also need to think about what the risks or the benefits are of participation in research projects. And the benefits can be that people have their voices heard, they feel more engaged with a project or an activity, and they can potentially have their views being used to shape something that's happening in the future. However, there are also inherent risks as well to participation, particularly if you're doing research that involves things which might be legally dubious. So a lot of social science looks at things about crime or health or sexually transmitted diseases as an example, and people shouldn't be placed at personal risk from participation. So we have to be again aware of how the notions of confidentiality and how the evidence being provided and data being collected is used in a way which doesn't actually risk a person being identified or being singled out for repercussions afterwards. And part of this is to actually explain to people how they can stop participating in a project. So at the University of Manchester, participants are allowed to withdraw their information at any time during or after the project. So people have the right to say, I no longer wish to have my information used. And as a researcher, that can be quite frustrating, but there's nothing we can do about this. And we have to explain that right to people when they're actually being introduced to the project. And finally, on the information sheet, we'd have the contact details for further information of hopefully the academic leading the project, a website if there is one, and information about who's doing the project, who they're working with, and why they're doing the project. So there's quite a lot of issues there, but normally an institution will have a pro forma which you can sort of modify. But invariably, we have to think about what people will benefit from if they take part, how they can be informed about the information, their confidentiality, the information about what the project is, and how they can make complaints. And normally, if we have those things, will be covered by the university's sort of legal requirements and insurance. In addition to that, we'll also normally have a consent form. So this effectively confirms that the information in the participant information sheet, and that people are contributing to a project in a voluntary capacity. And this is why working with vulnerable groups can be quite difficult, because to gain informed consent, you have to be aware and understand the parameters of the study. This is why working with vulnerable groups can be quite problematic, because they might not be able to give you that consent. But the consent form will ask people to sign it and to date it and say, yes, I knowingly participate in this project. The consent form will also allow them the opportunity to say, I would like confidentiality or anonymity for my data to be used in the project. This can be a tick box, or it can be, but it has to be there, and it has to be sort of quite clearly presented. We also need to ensure that we follow the Data Protection Act in terms of how we will use their data, how we will manage their data, and how we will present their data in visible and public forums. So we have to conform to legal policy at a national level in the UK. And if you're working overseas, there will potentially be additional privacy or data protection issues which you'll have to think about as well. And finally, on the consent form, there's a need to have the person confirm that they actually want to take part. And this might sound quite trivial, but they need to actually have read through all the information, say, yes, this sounds like something that I would like to be a part of. And then we get the signature, and then they're covered by the consent and our ethical approvals forms. So lots of things to think about there, but normally there will be some form of pro forma or a set of ideas which are put forward by your ethical research committees to say this is how we would expect consent forms and participant information to be presented to people before or during the research project.
So just to sort of summarise some of that, and really, this is the ethical research checklist that we've tried to come up with, some things to make sure you're thinking about with your research. First is to remember the ethics of researching with vulnerable groups. Obviously, we talked about who those were earlier on, but if you are working with those, and you have to be particularly careful. The second is ensuring that participants understand what they're consenting to through the provision of information regarding the study and the research, and contact information about the project. So that's through the participant information sheet. Third is consent forms, making sure that people understand what they're consenting to and do consent to participate in the project, and can withdraw whenever they want to. Fourth is informing the people they are being researched. So it is possible to get ethical approval for covert research, where you don't tell people they're being researched, but it's harder. It's difficult. The general assumption with most research is you do tell people they're being researched. In some cases, that might not be possible. If you were researching arms dealers, for example, one would imagine they probably wouldn't want to talk about it. So that might be an example of a covert project. But you would, again, you'd need to be jumping through the hoops really to get approval for that kind of research. So some other last few things to remember to think about to be an ethical researcher is anonymization of data. So as Ian was saying, qualitative data can be very rich, so it can allow the identification of participants in some contexts. So I often do research in rural areas, villages obviously with small populations where people might know each other very well, so it can be clear to, if somebody who lives in the village was reading the project, okay, well, this is Mrs. Miggins at number 23 or whatever. So if you think that's a possibility, you must inform your participants that might happen. Try and mitigate it, but again, they need to be aware of that, and they may hopefully decide to participate anyway. But you need to they need to be clear about what the risks are. So notwithstanding anonymization, another key thing is to make sure you're managing data well. You're anonymizing transcripts. You're storing them safely on a password-protected drive in a locked filing cabinet and that kind of thing. And then when you get to the end of the project, destroy the data if that's appropriate. So this would be part of the ethical approval process. You would say when you're going to destroy the data, might be the end of the project, might be after publication. You just have to be clear about that as part of the process and to the people who are participating. So what we've done in this final podcast is just briefly run through some of the key points about ethics and about ethical approval. We'll talk through this more in practice on the day. But just before we finish, in these 4 podcasts, we've referred to a number of sources, and in the full day, we'll refer to many more. So just at the end here are 3 slides with all the references that we'll hear about on the day itself. Some of them have been in these podcasts, some haven't. But if you want to follow up anything that you've heard in any of the podcasts before the session, then here are the references to allow you to do so. So that's the end of the podcast and all 4 of the podcasts. So we hope they've been useful, and we look forward to seeing you on the 7th of March in Edinburgh.